I was just going to say good morning and thank you again for joining our session and again for bearing with us. So my name is Juliana, I'm the events coordinator for Lloyds Bank Foundation, and thank you for popping your name, organisation in the chat function so we can see where you're all tuning in from today. We will be recording the session, but your chat won't be recorded, so we won't see any of that in the recording going forward. So this session is designed to help you understand a little bit more about track and trace, something which is still actually quite new to all of us. But luckily we've got an expert here today who's going to walk us through this. So before I introduce Mark, I just want to mention again that the session will be recorded and anything you write in the chat will not be seen. We've got some scheduled breakout sessions as well. Those won't be recorded, and we also have some interactive things going forward as well, which won't be shown in the recording, but we'll speak through those as we go through. So I'd like to now introduce Mark from Hope May. So Mark has worked with organisations across the EU, and his interpretations of the law are really well tested, and he's helped over 650 charities to improve their compliance with the law. Mark works with us at the Lloyds Bank Foundation for England and Wales, offering data protection advice and guidance to charities. So without further ado, I'm going to hand over to you, Mark.
Juliana, thank you very much indeed, and welcome everybody, and thank you for making the time to attend this session. We are going to be talking about track and trace data and how the law applies, but we're also going to take this opportunity to talk about other compliance issues and to give you perhaps a little bit of insight into where you might need to make some changes and some improvements. Lots have changed in the last couple of years, and especially this year. So we thought we'd take that opportunity to guide you through and navigate some of those changes and some of those obligations that you are going to need to exercise. So key objectives today, how the law applies to personal data, a bit about track and trace if you are a venue and wondering what you should be doing, or if you're just interested about whether your personal data is going to be processed lawfully, should you share it with a venue. We're going to talk about the data subject rights, a couple of the rights, the most frequently exercised rights, and then we're going to talk about what a charity should be doing to comply with the GDPR. So in the news at the moment, of course, COVID-19 and track and trace data, and we'll come back to that. The other thing I wanted to briefly touch on was the Schrems 2 case. So you may or may not know that a case was brought was heard in the European Court of Justice, and Mr. Schrems argued that he didn't want his data to be shared by Facebook to the US. Managed to get to the European Court of Justice, and the case was upheld. And consequently, this has made, in theory, all transfers to the US unlawful. So, and we're all doing this, of course, if you're using Google or Facebook and many of the other US-based tech platforms, then your data will be probably backed up in the US. Now, that may not concern you and me too much, but of course, as data controllers, we're in charge and supposed to be in control of the data of our service users, our clients, our beneficiaries, even our staff. And the question of the legality of that transfer has come into focus. The US privacy, the EU US Privacy Shield was subsequently found to be invalid, and that was the safeguard that was put in place to ensure that these transfers were lawful. So that's now out the door, and that leaves us just with probably one or two other options, neither of which work particularly well. So we're in sort of limbo at the moment, waiting really to find out what we should be doing, and we're watching with some interest to advise our charities as to what they should be doing in the future, but nobody really knows what the answer to that is at the moment. So do keep an eye out for that, and what the EU and the UK, of course, after Brexit, may suggest could be the remedy to that issue. So the Schrems 2 case, quite a significant case in the news at the moment. And then moving on to COVID-19. So up until the 5th of November, this picture that I took in a pub that I visited probably wasn't true. Track and trace details of all guests are required by law. It wasn't actually law at that point, but the law changed on the 5th of November, and now it is, and we'll examine what the obligations are for different types of venue in due course. Let's just touch on Brexit. So, of course, we're currently abiding by the European Data Protection, General Data Protection Regulation. But of course, as of the 1st of January 2021, will no longer be part of Europe. The transition period will have ended, and any EU law will, of course, not apply. So we have created our own version of the GDPR, which is called the Data Protection, Privacy and Electronic Communications Regulation, or to its friends, the UK GDPR. Virtually the same as the current legislation, but it might be a good idea to update your policy wordings. So it would be inappropriate to have any mention of the EU on your website and in your policies. So would be a good idea to update your policies and notices to say UK GDPR. The other laws, the Privacy and Electronic Communications Regulation that governs electronic communications for fundraising purposes, marketing, that remains unchanged for the time being. And of course, our own Data Protection Act 2018 also remains unchanged. So those three pieces of law that come together to govern personal data in the UK. So do update your policies. With reference to the Schrems 2 case, do check for any international processing that you may be undertaking. There's a quirky bit of the law that says that on the 1st of January or right at the end of December, if we've not concluded a deal with the EU, then we may not have our adequacy decision. Now, adequacy is really important. At the moment, all EU states recognise one another as adequate, and this includes some other countries like Switzerland and Iceland are considered to be adequate, and adequacy really relates to the national laws of that country being adequate in terms of upholding the fundamental rights and freedoms of their citizens. Strangely, we may lose our adequacy decision as we leave the EU. We've acknowledged that all EU states are adequate, but the EU has not reciprocated in that decision. Now, what that will mean is that data may flow out of the UK into the EU unhindered, but without an adequacy decision, it may not be able to return. So you'd essentially not have access to your own data if you were storing it in the EU. Safeguards will be required, or an adequacy decision to ensure that that is possible in the future. We wait with great anticipation as to whether that adequacy decision will come. And I think that there will be inevitable change fairly quickly, I think, to UK data protection law. So we'll wait and see what happens, and watch that very carefully. The UK GDPR is designed to make GDPR British, which we always makes us smile. Moving on to collecting track and trace data. What are your obligations? So we've studied the very latest guidance on this matter, and here are a few important points. So track and trace does depend upon the type of venue that you are. Hospitality gets a bad rap. If you're a pub, restaurant, or a cafe, then not only must you collect track and trace data, but you must also refuse entry to individuals that do not share their data with you. And the guidance says you'd be applying your normal security measures in this particular instance, which might, for example, include calling the police. So you've got to be quite robust in your approach to track and trace data if you're in hospitality. But other venues, such as community centres and libraries, This is not the case. You are encouraged to collect the data. You would be, of course, encouraging your visitors and your attendees to share their data, but you do not have to refuse entry in those instances. This will be a matter for you to decide, or those venues to decide what their policy will be in those instances. So distinct difference between hospitality and other venues. Also, you would not deny entry to a homeless person who didn't have that information, a telephone number or something, so it does not apply to homeless people. Guidance does not apply to places of worship either, so you do not need to collect any data if you are a place of worship. Interestingly, this includes where that space has been hired out, presumably for any purpose. If that is the case, then information does not need to be collected. The data that should be collected should start with, a preference is a telephone number. Then if a telephone number is not available, an email address, and if that's not available, then a postal address should be collected. The date, obviously, of the visit, the time of arrival, and if possible, the time of departure too, although the guidance does recognise this may be problematic. You should also record the details of the staff that were attending at that particular day, or if you had a shift pattern, for example, who was attending at that particular time. The use of the NHS QR app is not considered to be a precondition of entry. So if I don't want to use that app, then I should be able to supply my details in another way. And interestingly, do not temperature test. Now, the guidance doesn't actually say that, but we picked up on this some time ago. So the European Data Protection Supervisor that oversees many of the aspects of data protection in the EU said that temperature testing might well be an infringement of our human rights. The issue, I think, is if you arrived at your restaurant and a temperature test was a precondition of entry, is the person that's taking the temperature, are they a health professional? Are they able to make a health diagnosis if you had an elevated temperature? Because really, the issue is that an elevated temperature could be lots of different things, not necessarily a COVID. And so without an ability to actually give a diagnosis, the temperature test seems to be really rather inadequate. So we recommend, given that, and given the fact that the guidance doesn't actually mention temperature testing, we think it probably best not to take temperatures. And then advanced booking system is a record of those individuals, so you wouldn't need to collect the data again. So if you were using that kind of advanced system, of which there are many new systems on the market, then you don't have to ask me for my data again when I arrive. This is probably the most important thing on this slide, is new technology. So I have noticed that lots of new apps have sprung up which enable you to collect data more effectively and quickly. However, the GDPR does say that a data protection impact assessment must be conducted, especially where there is sensitive information being processed. But if you're collecting data in a new way, which of course this would be, wouldn't it? Then you should understand the risks that you're creating when you process the data. So conducting a data protection impact assessment is a lawful requirement, and I can only imagine how many organisations have not conducted one of these, but are collecting data using new technology. So do think about that. A record of that would be very important if you were asked by the ICO if you had conducted one or not. Data such as this should only be collected retained for 21 days. You can imagine though, can't you? I do think that this whole process is a ticking time bomb of personal data breaches, because before the before the second lockdown, sort of in between the two. I did my market research so I asked a few venues how long they were going to keep my information for, and there was a great deal of uncertainty. And one person even said, well, actually, we're going to keep it forever, which I'm hoping was a joke. Anyway, 21 days, then it must be destroyed. And it must be destroyed effectively. Some organisations will be keeping paper-based filing systems, for example, a clipboard or something. Very, very important that these records are effectively destroyed, and all of them. So if you've got, if you're doing it electronically and there's a copy of that record, then you want the copies to be deleted as well. So no trace of that information whatsoever. And all of this, the guidance ends up saying, should be done in accordance with the GDPR, with UK data protection law. And we thought we'd spend the rest of this course talking about what that really means, not just to track and trace data, but to all of the data that you might process. But before we do that, I've got a question for you, and we're going to run a little breakout session on this. Why is privacy important? I'm interested to know why privacy is important to you. Juliana.
And so I've just launched the poll, what is defined as personal data. So hopefully you can see that on your screen. It is anonymous, so don't worry about your answers, but it'd be great if you could give that a go now, and we'll be able to share those very, very shortly. Thank you.
And I think this is a really interesting question, because we'll all have a slightly different view of what privacy, a different opinion of what privacy is. A lot of people say to me, I've got nothing to hide. I don't do anything wrong. Privacy is not that important to me, therefore. And other people are very private people and take this a different view of that. So I'm really interested to see what you think.
So just looking at the results that are coming in, there's got a few people left to vote, but as it stands, you've got 35 people who think it's a letter you receive addressed to the homeowner, 65% social media post you make to your account, and 80% are the pictures that you took on holiday.
And sorry, those votes are, the question was, which of these is personal data?
What is defined as personal data?
Okay, can you just read those results out to me again?
Yep, I can. So I'm going to end the polling now. So I'll share the results. So everyone, you should be able to see on your screen. So 34% believed it was a letter that you received addressed to the homeowner. 63% believed it was a social media post you make to your account, and 80% believed it was the pictures you took on holiday.
Great. Okay, what an interesting mix. Are we back on?
Yeah.
Okay, thanks ever so much for that poll. That is really interesting. And I sort of tricked you a little bit there because I want to bring up a very important point. So the majority of you think it's the pictures that you took on holiday. And in actual fact, you're right, that is personal data, of course. The reason I wanted to put that particular option in for you is that although it's personal data, there's this clause, this article in the GDPR that talks about whether data is being used for personal purposes or not. So, when you took those pictures on holiday, you might have posted them on Facebook or shared them with friends. The law doesn't apply to those photographs. So it's because you're processing them for purely personal and domestic purposes, law doesn't apply. If, however, you decided to take those photographs as an organisation, as a charity, and use them to promote your aims and objectives or a fundraising campaign or something, then all of a sudden the law does apply and things change very much in that respect. So the scope of the law then covers those those pictures. So it's very interesting. I was saying to Juliana before we started that, you know, if you sort of were an amateur photographer, for example, you would obviously go out in the streets and take photographs. Anyone that you captured in those photographs is not, that photograph is not covered by the law. So that's really important. The other option, option A, a letter to the homeowner, interestingly isn't personal data, because the letter is addressed to the person that owns the home, but there's no personal data being used. There's no name, no details of your identity. So that probably isn't personal data. Although if it included your home address would be personal data. So it's just unraveling those categories of information that may identify you. Homeowner could be anybody, but if it's an address, then that would be your personal data. So that's a really useful exercise. Thank you for that. I think that it's very well defined what privacy is in law. Privacy is a human right. You have the right to privacy in your home and in your correspondence. And I think we should think about the UK GDPR, the Data Protection Act, and PECA as the mechanics that make that happen, that make that work for you, and ensure that you've got rights over your privacy, and you can exercise those rights that we'll be talking about a little bit later on. So privacy is very important. We'll come back to privacy with another question about Facebook in due course. Thanks very much for your input on that. Just talking about privacy for a moment. Before the lockdown, here I am in Norfolk for a weekend away, and I'm checking out of the hotel, and I took this photograph, which is reception. So I'm just waiting to pay my bill here, and I noticed those screens on the back wall there. And indeed, when you zoom in, it's a very elaborate CCTV system, which is spanning every corner of the hotel for presumably for security reasons. But this is pretty bad practice. This isn't really upholding privacy to the highest possible standard, in my opinion. These screens should not be on view to the public. They should be turned away. Yes, they are an important aspect of security and safeguarding and so on, but I think seeing them clearly like this is probably an infringement of potential privacy of those that may be captured in those images. So I think that's an important way of looking at privacy as well. And then I think we're going to run a poll here. I'm interested to know what is defined as personal data in your opinion. What is personal data? Is that right, Juliana?
Yeah, so that's what that's a poll that I launched just a little bit earlier. So what is defined as personal data? And we had an overall winner that came back with 80% saying that it was the pictures that you took on holiday were classified as personal data. Thank you, Juliana.
No one said this was going to be easy. So here's the technical definition of personal data. It's information that relates to your identity as a natural living individual, directly or indirectly. So obviously it's going to be your name and your home address, your telephone number, your email address, but it's other things like your location, for example. So if you're using one of those apps to keep fit that tracks your location, then that is also your personal data. Your economic, cultural or social likes and dislikes, characteristics are all your personal data. So I think this is important when you are processing data to think about what could be an identifier. My IP address on my computer is personal data. If you run a membership scheme, for example, and you issue me with a membership number that's unique and would never be used again for any other member, then that membership number is also personal data. So I think it's important to remember when we're setting up our systems and deciding what we're going to do and the services that we're going to deliver. Important as we record that information, that we record, obviously you're going to record what you need to record, but important to identify as personal information. And here's an interesting question for you. These three people have something in common. And I can tell you that that common denominator is that they are now all criminals. I'll just quickly whiz you through the stories. So these, and I'm sure you'll agree, they all look like sensible, law-abiding individuals, but they all broke the same law. They all accessed data without authority. So Shamim here, she was taking information from her employer, and she was emailing it to herself, her own personal email account. And she was, this was discovered, and as you can see, she was fined, lost her job, and now has a criminal record for unauthorized access to data. We don't know too much about why Shamim was doing that. Faye, we do know a little bit more about. Faye found out that her partner was having an affair, and the person that he was having the affair with was also a patient at the clinic in which she worked. So with that burning motivation, she took the opportunity to access that person's data to find out perhaps a little bit more about her. This was discovered, and again, the same outcome. She was prosecuted, fined, and lost her job. And finally, probably my favorite one is Kevin. So Kevin worked as senior local government officer. His partner was applying for a job at the same department as him, and because he could, he downloaded all of the CVs of all of the other applicants for the job and shared them with his partner, presumably to give his partner that advantage at the interview stage. This was discovered, and again, Kevin was prosecuted and fined. And I think with Kevin in particular, he knew he was doing wrong at this particular time, but I'm sure he didn't think it was a criminal matter. He knew he was breaking the rules, bending the rules, but I think he probably didn't think that it would end up like this. So the story here, the important message here, is that we should only be accessing data for the purposes that we are authorized to do so. And it's that moral compass. It's obvious, really, when you think about it. I should not be accessing data for my own purposes. Even if I do have access to it, I should not be looking. These are important lessons to be learned, and there was quite a flurry of these prosecutions last year. Do remember that. And I think that, I suppose the way to look at it is if you, for example, had a service delivery team that was delivering services to perhaps vulnerable individuals, and those records included sensitive data like health information, for example, and you had a fundraising team, does the fundraising team really need access to the sensitive information of the service users? Probably not. And if it's technically and physically possible to deny access, then you should put those measures into place. And quick story here. You may recognize the gentleman on the left, but the guy on the right is Aaron Banks. And this story just illustrates very well how our data is misused. So if you've ever used moneysupermarket.com, I have recently to renew my car insurance. You're using that to save money. And because of that, you're very happy to share almost any information that moneysupermarket.com thinks they need in order to measure your risk, in this particular instance with car insurance, to measure your risk as a driver and issue you with a premium which might well save you money. So effectively, you're swapping your personal data for a financial reward. And 32 million people in the UK have done that through moneysupermarket.com, which makes them a very valuable, very powerful organization. But when you do that, when I did that, I agreed to their terms and conditions, and moneysupermarket.com shares my data with 17 car insurance companies, and Eldon Car Insurance, which is owned by Aaron Banks, is one of those. And sure enough, 17 insurance companies did a soft credit check on me, and Eldon was one of them. All of that perfectly legitimate, of course. But what wasn't legitimate was that Aaron Banks, who was the voice of the Leave EU campaign, thought he'd use that data that was shared with him by moneysupermarket.com, give it to Cambridge Analytica, that clever company that came up with that very simple, very effective algorithm on Facebook, and see whether any of you were on the fence with regard to the Brexit vote. And if that was the case, then you would be micro-targeted with some advertising to see if they could convince you to vote for the Leave campaign. Aaron was fined for this, not a significant amount, and it just goes to show that behind the scenes, our data is flowing left, right and centre, and fundamentally one of our rights on data protection is the right to be informed. We're supposed to know what's happening with our data all of the time, and I suspect that we don't. So, interesting case there. And here we wanted to ask you, I think, for your thoughts on Facebook. So I'm supposing that many of you have got a Facebook account. I'm very interested to know where you stand on that and privacy. And I think we're going to break out, aren't we, Juliana?
Yeah, it'd be really helpful. I realise I can't see you on the screen now, but it'd actually be really helpful if you could just pop in the chat a quick yes if you do have Facebook, or if your charity has Facebook, and that way we can see how many of you on here do have Facebook.
Yes.
So a lot of yeses flying through, which is great. And what we're going to do just for the next couple of minutes is we're going to break out into some small groups, and it just wanted you to chat through with your group, kind of where do you stand on Facebook and where do you stand on privacy, whether or not yes you have your own Facebook, or if you've got a charity Facebook and how that links between the two, or maybe any questions that you might have coming out of that. So I'm just going to pop you into breakout rooms now, and this is going to be a couple of minutes, and then hopefully you'll be able to meet a few people that you haven't met before, which will be really nice. So you should see a button on your screen that allows you to go to your breakout rooms. Do you please click on that, and it will bring you back in a couple of minutes time.
Okay. I'm very interested in your view of privacy. Many people tell me that they are now using Facebook differently. People have actually cancelled their accounts, and certainly it seems that we're using Facebook less than we have in the past. But the thing that strikes me, and I'm thinking about you as a charity and your use of social media, is, you know, when you took those pictures of yourself on holiday and you posted them on Facebook, you may not have updated your preferences, although you could have done, but you haven't updated your preferences in recent times, and that means that the world can see your holiday snaps and pictures of what you had for dinner. And so on. The question I suppose that I always like to ponder is, did you post those pictures of your holiday for me to see, for a complete stranger to browse through? And I would say you probably didn't. And the fact that you haven't changed your preferences is not an excuse for me to look. So I think when organizations are are using social media, I think we need to be very cautious about privacy. Bear in mind that you can't unsee something. I delivered a speech last year to a group of bursars at various colleges, and they were telling me that they use social media to monitor their staff, that their staff are in fact very much part of the college, and therefore their behaviour is important. And whilst that might seem practical, I think the issue arises as to, but when I look at my staff's social media accounts, what might I see? I'm not talking about criminal activity, but what if there was something that a member of your staff does or did that you personally found unsavoury, that you personally didn't agree with? Now you've seen it, you can't unsee it, and is it going to change your opinion of that person, when actually that was very much their personal activities, thoughts, and behaviour, none of which are illegal. So why would you look? And if you did, and that changed your opinion of that person, does that mean that they would then perhaps receive detrimental effect because of that from you as the as the employer. So I think it's an interesting conundrum, and I think that social media is still relatively new as a channel, and we're still learning about how to use it. For example, if you were using Facebook lookalike audiences to further your fundraising activities, at the moment as it stands, that's perfectly lawful, because as you do that, you enter into a third-party agreement with Facebook. And you and I, as Facebook account holders, have agreed to all of this. We didn't realize that, but we didn't read the terms and conditions, so we're only ourselves to blame. And that data is shared with those who wish to buy it. And again, the European Data Protection Supervisor has pointed out that this is an infringement of our privacy. We didn't realize when we opened our account that this sort of thing was going to go on. And I think that's the reason, many of the reasons why Facebook is being prosecuted in most countries of the world for some infringement or other. And I think the issue is that your data and my data is worth so much money that it will be very hard to make Facebook change, because even fines don't really hit the target particularly well. So Facebook, if you're using Facebook or other social media platforms, do think about privacy and how that's going to affect those that may be identified. Very quick update on or chat about terms of reference. There's some words that we use all of the time. I just want to make sure that we understand exactly what they are. So data processing, we use that word all of the time. What does it really mean? Well, it's the collection, recording, transmission and storing of data. Now that last statement is very, very important. Just storing data is also processing data. So, if you're keeping data, we've come across dusty boxes in cupboards of old records that no one's got the guts to destroy, but the fact is that that data is still being processed. So storing data is processing data. And interestingly, we had a case recently, even if you don't have access to data that's under your control, you're still processing that data. So do bear in mind that, that this is a very all-encompassing word. Also, data controller, data processors, quick description of those. You're all data controllers because you've got staff and volunteers, and you are therefore in control of the data of those individuals. So it's an organization that decides the means and purpose of processing that data. You need the data in order to undertake an activity, and that makes you a data controller. On the other hand, you might be a data processor, and that's where an organization, and it has to be a separate entity, that's where an organization works on behalf of a data controller to process data. So, for example, your payroll provider would be a data processor. So you've you've third-partied that activity to another organization. They're performing a task on your behalf, but it involves the data of your staff, makes them a data processor. You can be both, but not for the same data. So you might have concluded a contractual arrangement where referrals are made to you. If that's the case, then you've got to decide whether you're a data processor or a data controller. Many of the contracts that we read do suggest in those circumstances where a charity is dealing with referees that they're a data processor. But I think if you're making decisions and determinations about that person in order to be able to support them, you're probably a data controller. But often these contracts suggest the opposite. So important to read those through. So data processing, and whether you're a data controller or a data processor, is very, very important. Gets you off on the right foot. I think we're going to take a 5-minute convenience break now, and we'll be back for our first question time after that. So if you do have any questions, we'd be delighted to spend a little time seeing if we can answer any of those for you. So just a 5-minute break now. See you in a moment.
Thank you, Mark. That's brilliant. And if everyone could pop themselves on mute or turn their videos off, go and grab a cup of tea or stretch your legs and do whatever you need to do. And then we'll reconvene at about 10:56 on the dot. We'll come back and start with our question time. So thank you so much. Wonderful. So we've got a question that says, how do you stand with GDPR if you have your work email on your personal mobile?
How your work email on your right? Okay, so for the organisation, the issue there, of course, is that information that the organisation is a data controller of is being potentially stored on your personal device, and that could be a problem. When you come to leave the organisation, of course, you'll have to make sure that all of the information for which your organisation is the controller is deleted from your personal device, and really. That's very important for the organisation to maintain that control of that information. You know, a lot of people are using personal devices, especially at the moment with remote working. And I think that, again, this is an issue for the future as we try to mop up the data for which we are the controller, as you know, as we unlock, go back to some sort of sense of normality. So personal devices are a problem. You know, if you, for example, decided to change your computer and upgrade some new amazing device, the old one needs to be dealt with properly. You can't really give it away. You can't sell it on eBay unless, of course, it's been cleaned professionally to ensure there's no residue data on it. I hope that helps.
Brilliant. Thank you. Just got a few more quick questions. I'm going to amalgamate these two. Someone's asking if you're using a calendar system for booking clients in, and equally, if you've got like a service monitoring track and trace, do you need to have separate records for those? So if you've got a calendar system booking people in, you know when they're coming, and also if they're keeping attendance records as part of service monitoring, does that count as track and trace?
Yeah, I think that you're going to do what you need to do to make your system and services work. So if you need to keep attendance records for the purposes of delivering your service, then you should do that. And if you are required to collect track and trace data, then you'll do that separately. But you'll keep those two sources of data probably for different time periods. So the track and trace 21 days. The other data, the other attendance data, you might keep for as long as you've decided it's necessary to keep.
Wonderful. Have we got time for just one more quick question?
Let's do one more.
Okay, there's so many coming in. I'm so sorry that we can't answer all of them, but what we'll do is I'll try and get these over to Mark after the session, and we'll get some answers for you there, so you're not left high and dry on these. So I think you mentioned this earlier, if you've obtained a QR code for your own venue, do you then need to use a separate NHS track and trace?
No. So remember back on that slide that the use of the NHS QR system is not a precondition of entry. You do not need to use that. You can decide what is best for you. Could be pad and pen if that's the system you've decided is right for you, or any other system of recording. It does say, by the way, in the guidance, that if you were using a paper-based record, then that should be kept out of sight of the public. Again, that's that privacy question, isn't it? Making sure that others can't see who's been in the venue ahead of them. So use the system that suits you best, which might be the NHS app.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. And thank you everybody for your questions. I'm sorry that we haven't had time to go through them. But Mark, I'm sure you'd be happy to maybe send those afterwards and we can get some answers to those in due course. But we're going to push on forward. There's a lot of information to get through. So Mark, I'm going to hand back over to you. Thanks very much indeed. Yes, please. We will respond to your questions. I promise. So a quick talk about what we need to do to be lawful. Now, actually, there are only a few things that the law actually says that you should do. So you should have a policy, a data protection policy, probably quite a detailed document that talks about what you do, why you do it, and makes this sort of statement that you are compliant and that you understand what my rights are and you understand what the lawful conditions are for processing my data, and you've chosen the ones that are right for you. So it's a kind of
way of demonstrating what your intentions are around my data. So a data protection policy is very important, but that's very different to the statement that's probably on your website. So on your website there'll be something, and there's a variety of different names for these things. Some people call them a privacy policy, a privacy notice. But that is not your policy. What that is under Article 13 and 14 of the GDPR, it says that you must inform the data subjects prior to the processing of their data certain specific things. And that notice is Article 13. Effectively, you are saying that you're a data controller and that I've got 8 rights and that you're going to be using my consent. And if I want to complain, then you've given me the link to the ICO so that I can very easily complain about your processing of my data, and so on and so forth. So that notice is not your policy, and it should include all of the requirements of Article 13 and 14 of the GDPR. So take a look at that and make sure that you feel you're up to date. The ICO's website has a wealth of guidance on this matter, so make sure that's the case. So you've got your data protection policy, you've got your notice on your website, and the only other thing that you might need, which is a lawful requirement, is something called a record of processing activities, your ROPAs. And that normally is a spreadsheet. There's some good examples, good templates on the ICO's website for this particular document, and it kind of tracks, it's like an overview of your processing in a way, and it records all of the things that you do, and your purposes and means for conducting that sort of processing, or whatever processing it is that you're doing. So your policy, your notice, and your ROPAs are lawful requirements. Yes, you need data sharing agreements and processor agreements, but those 3 are very, very important, and making sure that they're in place. And I've listed there a few other things that you might consider. And remember, the GDPR and data protection generally is a risk-based piece of legislation. So if you don't have one of those documents, then perhaps your risk has gone up. And if you do implement one of those, then you could argue that your risk is now reduced. So think about it from that point of view, and make sure that you've got those appropriate documents in place. Another really important thing is your activity reporting. Now, this can be done in any way that suits you, but we think this is very important because if you were ever interviewed by an enforcement officer at the ICO, they want to know the sort of history of these things. What's been going on? You've been on a journey, haven't you? And we'd like to see your records of that journey. And we think that should include the good, the bad, and even the ugly, in terms of events and incidents that have happened. So you might, for example, put in your activity log that you attended today's session, and hopefully you've taken something away from today, which is a good thing. But tomorrow you might have a minor breach that's not reportable, and that's a bad thing. So you'd want to include that. So I think the richer the detail on your activity and incident reporting, the better, because the ICO know we're only human, they know we're going to make mistakes, and they would expect to see some negative entries in that report, because you've these things happen, but you've learned from them and you've made some improvements to your process and activities. You can expand your policy framework. Lots of organizations have now using social media, of course, as we said earlier. So you might have a social media policy. You might have a training policy if you've got a large number of volunteers or a high turnover of staff. You might decide that training and a policy around that is really important. Accountability. COVID-19, you might need a policy for that if you're a venue, and certainly some sort of policy or procedure around remote working for the foreseeable future might also be a very good thing. None of those are lawfully required, but this is about painting your picture of your compliance and colouring in and adding as much detail as you can. This is about demonstrating that you know what you're doing and that you're compliant with the law. Moving on, one of the most important aspects, there's 3 really. There's the principles of data protection that we'll talk about in just a moment, the rights, and this, the conditions. There are 6 lawful conditions for processing data, and you must have one of them. You must choose one of these at any given time. You can have more than one, but not for the same categories of data. It must be a chosen condition for each, and consent is the one that we're most familiar with. We're going to talk very, very briefly about the 3 most common conditions, which are consent, contractual obligation, and legitimate interest. The other 3 are important too, but with just the short availability of time, we're going to talk about those 3 most common ones. So we're going to do, Juliana, we are going to do a poll oh, we're going to do a poll, aren't we, on this?
Okay, so again, I have launched a poll. For those who are on the web version, apologies if you can't see this, but the question is measuring and determine valid content. So as you can see on Mark's slide there.
So let me just paint the picture very quickly for you. This relates to fundraising. You may not have fundraising, but you're very familiar with that that activity. So look, you've got this list of supporters that occasionally donate to your charity. You've been emailing them periodically over the past 3 years, asking them for donations. Some are donating, maybe some aren't. You can't actually remember where and how you got their details. You want to continue, but GDPR consent, you're worried about consent. It may or may not be valid. I need you to choose which one of those in that circumstance you would go for. Would you go for A, continue as you have been and assume that you've got consent, or B, send out an email asking them to opt in to future communications, or C, stop sending marketing materials altogether and develop a new consent-based strategy? Which would you, what would you do in those circumstances? So remember, these are people that you are already processing the data of.
The results are coming flying in. We appear to have an overall winner. We still have a few more people to vote, but as it stands, Mark, we've got 81% of people going with B, send out an email asking them to opt in to future communications. Then we have C, so 19% are saying stop sending marketing emails, materials, and develop a consent-based strategy. And nobody has gone with A.
Such a cautious bunch. So if you opted for B, then you'd have done this, which is the RSPCA. But I mean, I'm not picking on the RSPCA because everybody did this. So on that lead up to May the 25th, 2018, you would have received lots of communications, I guess, that were a bit like this, that said that changes to the law mean we now need your permission to continue contacting you, with the big red button, say yes. And that was the general theme of this initiative. So I think it's interesting. We have to refer to the Privacy and Electronic Communications Regulation, which says that you must have consent in order to send marketing and fundraising communications, and without consent those communications would be unlawful, and there have been some prosecutions around this. But it also says that asking me for consent is essentially also marketing. So you can't send an email to me asking me for consent if you haven't got consent, and so therefore, and again, you'd be breaking the law if you did so. So what's really interesting about this particular example is that in order to send this email from the RSPCA to me, the RSPCA must have had my consent, because they can't ask me to reconfirm my consent unless they've already got it. So that makes me wonder why they asked me for my consent when they already had it. So going back to that slide, actually, I think the answer's A, because if they were already communicating with me, and in this particular example, these individuals were already donating, then in order to communicate with them, to ask them for that money, you must have already had my consent. And so I think the answer is probably A. Now, those of you that chose B, I think there's a different way of doing it. I think that the communication doesn't say you must press this red button to confirm your consent, perhaps the red button says, if you want to opt out, then press the button. So it doesn't require an affirmative action on my behalf unless I want to change my mind. Because this is very important. If you sent this communication out to your donors and they don't press the red button, then a lack of affirmative action actually means they've opted out. So it's the opposite effect of what you really were hoping for. You lose donors on the basis of a lack of affirmative action. So I realise that we are all very risk avert in our sector, and that's why B felt right. And those of you, of course, that opted for C are not wrong, because many organisations realised that they didn't really know whether consent and where it was collected was valid at all, and therefore felt that starting over was a safer place. So I hope that helps, and I hope that I haven't confused the matter. But remember, if you ask me to consent and I don't make an affirmative action, even if you've already had my consent, you now don't have my consent. It's now gone. And here is what consent really is. It needs to be all 5 of these things unambiguously explained, so that I understand what I'm consenting to. I must freely give it. You can't tick any boxes on my behalf. You've got to be able to demonstrate when and how you got my consent, and it must be specific and informed. So, you know, a sort of a granular approach is very important. You can't sort of get consent for like a whole raft of different purposes. There should be different consents for different purposes, which altogether makes consent quite cumbersome in a way. And we think that due to the recent guidance on consent, it's probably not always, it's not the silver bullet we thought it was, and it's not always the best choice. And this also relates to your cookie policy. So if you're on a website and it says, by using our website, you agree to our cookie policy, that's now unlawful. I should be able to use the website without agreeing, without giving my consent. I should not have a detrimental effect just because I don't want to consent to these cookies being dropped. So make sure that your website doesn't say, by using our website, you agree to our policy. That's very much against my freedoms and my rights. So make sure that you do that. Moving on to the principles. So we've talked about the conditions. The principles are fundamental to compliance. Here they are. There are, in fact, 6 principles. I'll sum them up in because they are common practice, really. They are very straightforward. You've got to be fair, honest, lawful, and transparent with my data. You've got to have a purpose for processing my data, which is obvious, and I'm sure you do have. You've got to only process the data that you really need. So don't collect any categories of data that you don't need. So minimizing the amount of data that you're processing. Keep your records up to date, and they should be rectifiable if they're wrong. Retaining data for only as long as is necessary is key to lawful processing. And then keeping it safe and secure, making sure that the data is safe, secure, it can't be authorized by unauthorized individuals, and that sort of thing. You know, the question of home remote working comes into question there, doesn't it? As we've all dissipated across the country, is security as good as it was when we were all working in the same office? Probably not. So think about those principles. I wanted to talk to you about ethical processing. Now, this is perhaps a step beyond the law, and certainly for-profits don't much like the sound of ethical anything really. But of course, as charities, everything we do, we like to think is ethical. So ethical processing is very important, and probably takes our standard of compliance to a new level. I saw this picture I took this photograph recently, and I'm interested in why CCTV would need to be in operation 24/7. I think that on the face of it, it's probably about crime prevention, detection and safeguarding, and we all want to live in a safer place, so CCTV definitely plays its part. But that picture does confuse me a little bit. I mean, where is the camera? Is it looking at me at this moment as I take the photograph, or is it purely focused on the occupants of the vehicle? And how long is that information going to be kept for, and who might it be shared with? I don't feel that informed by that particular statement. And is that ethically right? They might not be breaking any laws, but I'm not sure that I feel entirely comfortable with that statement if I've got my privacy hat on. But I'm interested for you to have a think about that and see what you come up with and what your thoughts are. You might think, your opinion might be, well, I'm just mostly concerned about security and crime prevention, so that's fine by me. I was talking to a police officer recently, and he was telling me that the body cams that they wear now, their instructions are they should not be on all of the time. They're only on for evidence gathering, and I think that's where I feel most comfortable. But you might have a different opinion. And then the data subject rights. There are 8 of the rights. We're just going to talk about 2 of them. The first is the right of access. Now, I don't know if you've had any subject access requests recently, but if you're interested in knowing more about this, then there's some very good guidance that's just been issued by the ICO about this. And we thought we would just bring you up to speed with a few of the changes, or not so much changes, but the clarity that we now have around the right of access. So, Juliana, how are we going to do this?
Okay, so we've got another poll for our quiz time, which I'm just going to launch for you now. This is the right of access. Is that right? Yeah.
That's correct.
Okay, so hopefully on your screens you will see some questions that are on your screens. Do go ahead and answer those that are on your screen. So the first question for those who may not be able to see the poll are you obliged to share copies of your documents? The second question is, are you obliged to provide all the information requested? And third is, which one of the following is true? How long can you take and fulfill a SAR, which I was meant to write out? Mark, can you remind us what an SAR is?
It's a subject access request.
Brilliant. And then goes on to be just a few more questions. I can just read out which of the following is true? Are there any circumstances in which you can stop the clock? True or false? Can you keep a record of the data subject to ensure you have a record of the action? So people are just bringing those votes in now. Mark, if there's anything else you want to talk about while these polls are coming through, conscious of the time, then you could.
Yes, we are desperately short of time, but I'll just I think probably best just wait for those answers, and then I'll just answer those, and then we'll move on. How are we doing?
Good. We're getting a lot of votes are coming in, so I'm just going to leave it for like another maybe 30 seconds for people to vote. It's very interesting to see okay. The results coming through.
Well, I think what is interesting is that the text on the GDPR doesn't really give you a lot of detail. This guidance that's come out, actually, some of the best guidance I've seen from the ICO, common sense prevails, and I think it will make life a lot easier for organisations to effectively answer these access requests. We do a lot of access requests for our clients, and generally speaking, people make access requests when there's another problem, there's another issue that needs answering, and they're looking for evidence or data to support that problem that's been created.
So we've got our answers in, which I'll happily share with you, Mark, if you are ready.
Yes, please, fire away.
So for question 1, are you obliged to share copies of documents? We had 63% people say yes, 29% of people say no, and actually there was 8% of people who didn't know, who weren't sure.
Okay, let's quickly answer that. So the new guidance says that you are not required to share copies of actual documents. The right is an access to information contained within those documents. So not copies of actual documents, just the information from within them.
Wonderful. So question 2, are you obliged to provide all the information requested? So we had 39% people say yes, 50% say no, and a further 11% didn't know.
Okay, so we're not required to provide all of the information that's been requested. The new guidance says that we are able to offer a selection of data from that may identify the individual. So your question for yourselves, I suppose, is what does a selection mean, and what will a selection include? Will help you to forge your policy on this around this right.
Question 3, which one of the following is true? How long can you take to fulfill an SAR? 28 days, 68% of people said 28 days, 11% said a month, 3% said as long as it takes, and 18% don't know. Okay,
so the answer is B, 1 month. So you can, yes, so basically 1 month. But the next question is very important and pins itself to this question. So 1 month in theory is what the law says.
And then question 4 is which one of the following is true? Are there any circumstances in which you can stop the clock? And the highest rating answer was B, you don't know what information you're looking for, so you ask the requester for help.
Did anyone vote C?
No, no one voted C.
Well, of course, you're right. This is all about asking for scope. You don't know what you're looking for. Individuals ask for all of the data that identifies them, and that might be a lot of data. So that's very hard for you. It makes life very difficult. So you're going to reach out and ask for some assistance. What is it that you're actually looking for? We're here to help. And at that point, you're now allowed to stop the clock, which I think is really good and makes a lot of sense, because when you ask people for help, sometimes they don't even know what they're looking for. It could take them a week to reply. So a week out of your month is a lot of your available time. So you can stop the clock in circumstances like that. Great. Thank you very much for participating in that. The other right that we wanted to talk about was the right to be forgotten. And the question that people ask is, can we keep a record of that person to ensure that we know that we've forgotten them? So can we keep a record of somebody that we've forgotten so that we know that we've forgotten them? And I'm afraid the answer to that is no. And people say, well, but if we did completely erase that person and they came back, then we wouldn't recognize them as somebody that we worked with before or who had funded our organisation before. I'm afraid that is the case. I think that if someone asks to be forgotten or to be erased, it's important to tell them that that is the case. You won't recognise them when they return a second time, if indeed they do, and that they will be treated as a new supporter or a new service user or client in that respect. So make sure that they understand that. But I think it's really important to not have any records of people that you have forgotten. Very, very briefly chat about special data. So, you know, there are two types of data. There's regular data and special category data. Regular data is your name and your postal address and your date of birth, that sort of thing. The Commissioner's not too concerned about that. Of course, it's still a breach if you lost control of it, but regular data, generally, I think, because it's, you know, I could probably find some of that data in the public domain. It's circling around. It's still personal data. It's still applicable to the law, but I think there's less focus on that sort of data. But special category data is what the Commissioner is very, very interested in and very concerned about the safe processing of. And there is a list of the categories of special category data: your health, your mental health, your ethnicity, your political and philosophical opinions, and so on and so forth. If you're processing any of that data, you do want to be on your toes, I think, and making sure that the highest possible standards are applied to this. You might, for example, keep special data for less time than regular data. And then just a quick word about a data breach. I think we were going to ask you what you thought a data breach was. As I'm talking, please, I'd be interested to hear what you've got to say on chat as to what a data breach is. Is that right, Juliana? Okay.
Yeah, that's fine. We're running quite quickly out of time, but do just pop in the chat what you think a data breach is, and Mark will talk to you on that just before we have to wrap up there.
So a data breach is essentially so of course there's two types of breaches. There's the breach that you're going to report to the ICO, and the breach that it's still a breach but you're not going to report. So if it was regular data, I would suggest in small quantities you probably won't report it, but you're going to keep a record of it. But if it's special data, then you're almost certainly going to report it to the Information Commissioner. And the definition of a breach is the loss of control of personal data for which you are the data controller. So remember that. I think that we must be maintaining control of data wherever we possibly can. And I'll just leave you with this picture that I took, actually it was last year, down at the local railway station, which we used to go to every day. And I noticed this is the inside of the cupboard in which the station computer is kept. And I noticed these 4 tickets that have got handwriting on them. And I took a photograph of it, just wondering, I wonder what that is. And I can zoom in for you and confirm that it is in fact the computer password, which is on public display and is very much a breach of security. I don't know what would happen if I attempted to log into the station computer, but I could cause some havoc if I knew what I was doing. This is there because there's a high turnover of staff and there's a shift pattern, and how else would you inform people of a password to the computer? But that is just not good enough. Here's a picture I took on the Underground. Feels like 10 years ago, but I think it was earlier in the year. Bear in mind, everybody's trying to steal your data. I know we all do this, but I don't know what the guy on the right was actually doing, but just if it was processing data for your organization, then this is in theory a breach of your policies. So be very, very cautious. And that is indeed the end of today's session. I hope that was useful. I'd be very, very happy to answer any further questions at this point, or if we can collect questions, Juliana, I'd be very happy to answer those, and perhaps we could circulate a communication after today.
Wonderful. A huge thank you to Mark. It's a lot to get through and really appreciate it. Also, thank you to Taylor, who's in the background doing the wonderful slides and visuals. And we will formally end the session there. I've popped a true fashion. I've popped Taylor. I've popped a poll on your screen that just allows you to give some feedback on the session for both the foundation and for Mark as well. So please, it'd be wonderful if you could fill that out, and completely appreciate that it's 11:30 and you all have some busy days. So do feel free to pop off once you've done the feedback. If you do want to stay on the call, we can go through the questions. I'm more than happy to do that as well, and we'll circulate those to Mark afterwards as well if you do have to pop off now. But Mark, what I might do is just read some of those questions now, and if grantees and stuff you want to stay, that's fantastic. If not, then like I said, do feel free to pop off and we'll keep the recording going, so the answers will be on there for you. And we will be sharing the presentation after this session. Please don't worry, it's a lot of information to retain. So I'm just going to scroll through, Mark, and just see some of the questions that we've got, if that's all right.
Yeah, of course. Yeah, please.
So there's so many, which is brilliant. Someone was asking, how long should you retain recruitment data for? So, for example, like application forms.
Oh, so I think if you've got unsuccessful applicants, then I think that you should probably get rid of delete that data, fairly quickly. You're not going to recruit those individuals. You might as well delete the data. 3 months or 6 months, you might want to give some feedback to individuals as to why they weren't successful. But other than that, there's no point. And also, just on that interesting question, if you're thinking of keeping CVs for a future opportunity, so you might say to somebody, I'll retain your CV because we are expanding and you never know, there might be an opportunity in the future. You would need their consent. And with consent comes that burden of deciding how long consent is valid for, and so on. So I would recommend not keeping a pool of CVs. Just do your recruitment as and when you need it.
Great. A quick question came through. I think it was probably after the train station picture on passwords. Have you got any guidance on managing passwords?
There's a lot of guidance online on passwords. So generally, as a sort of tip, the longer your password is, it's much more difficult to crack. So think about a mixture of numbers and letters and symbols as good policy. I think changing passwords too frequently is actually detrimental. People can't remember passwords, and so changing them frequently becomes a burden. So I think a good, strong password is the answer. But probably most importantly, don't use the same password at work that you do outside of work. Make sure that there's that partition between the two.
Brilliant. We've still got quite a few people on the call, so if you're happy to keep going.
Yeah, please. Yeah.
So we had a question on potentially how would you deal with maybe service users or volunteers who are quite reluctant to give over their data? It may be they for many different reasons, and if they're just quite reluctant to do that, how do you potentially enforce it, or do you enforce it?
Well, I think it's difficult with a volunteer. By the very nature of a volunteer, they're there out of the goodness of their heart, making a difference. If they don't want to share their information, and that information is very important to you to be able to safeguard them or to deploy them as a volunteer, then they can't really be a volunteer if they're not going to give you the information that you need. So I think trying to explain to them that your policies are very strong and that you're only going to use their data for this particular purpose, hopefully will convince them that it's required. But if you can't get it, then it's difficult to deploy them, I would have thought. What was the other part of the question, Juliana?
So it was basically asking what you answered in terms of people are quite reluctant and they don't want to share their data because of potential mental capacity or learning disabilities or things like that. Like how would you go about maybe enforcing it, or do you enforce it?
I think with service users it might be different. In certain circumstances where you've got to support that individual who might be at risk or vulnerable, then there are some exemptions to the law that allow you to process their data even without their knowledge, without their consent. And maybe, and I obviously don't know the context of the question, but maybe in certain circumstances where you have to process the data of a service user, one of the exemptions might apply. But with volunteers, it feels like, well, if you're not going to give me the information, how am I supposed to deploy your great the gift that you're making to us? Seems more difficult to answer.
Wonderful. And one question here says, we have freelance counsellors and we have asked them to register with the ICO. Although we are data controllers, they also now store some sensitive data on their own devices due to COVID. So just for protection, is this good practice? Is this okay to do?
Yeah, I think it is, because first and foremost, the operations of your organisation come first, don't they? You're delivering a service and operationally, you've decided to use freelancers to do that. I think it's good that they're registered with the ICO, and in that agreement that you've got with them, that document that says this is what you can expect of us and this is what we expect of you. I'd like to think there's a section in there about data protection and how together you'll address your obligations, perhaps as two controllers. On the other hand, you might argue that freelancer is actually a data processor, processing data that you've allowed for a particular specific purpose that you have decided upon. But anyway, regardless of whichever way you go with that, some kind of document and an agreement would be required.
Wonderful. And we had a question about equality and diversion. How long should you keep an equality and diversity monitoring form for new employees?
Well, any sort of data retention depends upon necessity. So we apply this in theory necessity test. So the question is I must keep data for as long as it is necessary, but if it's not necessary to keep it, then I shouldn't keep it. So the question that you should ask yourself about any document, regardless of its nature, is it necessary to keep this document? The problem that we have, you know, as people, is that we worry about deleting information. It concerns us. We always think, well, you never know, we might need this in the future. What if we needed it? And that drives us to keep data longer than we probably should. But I think we're coming to terms with this, and I think we are beginning to change. The tide is changing, and I think we're now thinking, is it necessary? If it's not necessary, then let's delete it. Let's delete all of the versions of that data. So just try and apply that necessity test. You know, you might not get it right all of the time. You may make a few mistakes, but this is a learning curve. We're all learning.
We just had a few more that I can amalgamate together. Somebody was asking about legitimate interest. Being asked to kind of how does legitimate interest play out in certain circumstances with consent? Right.
So that is a great question, and I really like legitimate interest as a condition for processing data. Because consent has become clearly a burden, it needs to be managed. It doesn't last forever. Legitimate interest is looking more and more interesting by the day. So first and foremost, legitimate interest is the interest of the organisation, your processing of my data to achieve your legitimate objectives, your aims and objectives as an organisation. It's not my legitimate interest, it's yours. I might have one, but this is not what this is about. This is about your interest to achieve your goal, your aims, your vision as an organisation. Now, the great thing about legitimate interest is that you don't need to tell me that you're processing my data about that. I don't need to be informed. I might have a reasonable expectation because of our relationship together, but you don't need to flag this prior to the processing. But for that reason, and because you'll be processing my data, without my knowledge necessarily, you've got to do a legitimate interest balancing test, so an assessment of your desire to process my data vis my rights, my fundamental rights and freedoms. And there's a template for this on the ICO's website, and it's a sort of series of challenges really around what you want to achieve, what data is concerned, and how this might affect my rights and freedoms as an individual. One of the really interesting questions that it asks is there another way of processing the data? Is there another way of achieving your goal without processing my data? And if you answer no to that, so if you answered yes, then you'd probably do that. If you answered no, however, then you're starting your case for processing around legitimate interest is starting to look more convincing. And that document, that assessment, you should keep that assessment, date it and keep it as your justification for using legitimate interest. Now, we had a case just recently around this, and we took some advice from the ICO on it. And the officer that I spoke to said something to me that changed my whole thinking about legitimate interest. And she said, because we always used to think legitimate interest was bottom of the pile, everything else was better than legitimate interest. But this particular officer said to me, legitimate interest is as strong as any of the other conditions if it's used in the right context. And I thought, that's true. That must be true, because there are 6 of them. They each play a part, and legitimate interest is one of those 6. It must be a strong condition, but you need to do the balancing test to prove it before you use it. I hope that's useful.
We just have one more question. here, kind of looking at, again, so looking at the track and trace. So can you clarify collection of data for track and trace when you hire, for example, a church for appointment-based client collection day? So for food and things like that, what is the clarification for track and trace?
If you mean, do you mean how it's collected? Because if it's how it's collected, then as we said earlier, you will have decided which is best for you. So you might be using some clever app, or you might be using a pad and pen. So your justification is that the guidance says and the law says that that must be the case if you're in hospitality. But if you're not in hospitality, then you'll need to make a decision for yourself as to what you collect, when you collect it, and you know, whether you're going to deny access to your venue if someone says no, I'm not going to give you my information.
Sorry, can I ask the question directly? Is it, what I need to know is, what is the legal position? Because obviously I can ask people for the information, but if they're coming, if the clients refuse to give that information, and
okay,
because what we're doing is we're hiring a church to give out food and clothes and everything to our clients, appointment based, but and I'm collecting track and trace. But what you said earlier very quickly was that it isn't absolutely essential for churches or the hires. So I just need that clarified, if you know the answer.
I think the answer is legitimate interest. I think that you would be collecting the data in the interests of your organisation because, you know, because of the guidance that's been issued. If you were in hospitality, however, because it's law for it to be collected, it would be a legal obligation to collect. So out of those 6 that you'll see on the slide when you get this deck, the legal obligation applies. But because that doesn't apply to your place of worship, then I would suggest legitimate interest is the obvious one to use. Does that help?
Yeah. Yes.
It is.
Okay, thank you. It's just it's such a difficult area, but I just needed that clarified, and you've answered it for me. Yeah, so we can argue on the basis of it's important to us rather than it being the law.
So it's not the law. So that one doesn't work. You could ask for consent, but that's I don't think that's going to suit you, because in order to say that you've got valid consent, you'd have to inform me about this, that, and the other, and you might not have the means to do that, or even the time. So legitimate interest feels right to me. That's what I would go with.
Thank you. Thanks.
Thank you, Mark. That's super helpful, and thank you for the final 16 people who have held on to this session. Those are the questions that we had. So thank you, Mark, for staying on and answering those. Really helpful, and it'll be helpful for the recording as well. And thank you for everyone for filling out the survey. I will bring this session to a close. We will send the slide decks out after this, and if you have any questions, do feel free to get back in touch with either one of us, and we'll be happy to answer those for you. So formally ending the session here now. So thank you again for everybody who joined, and big thank you again to Mark and Taylor as well.